The first thing Commander Eli Voss felt wasn't pain, but wrongness pure and profound, like a silent scream vibrating through the marrow of his bones. He opened his eyes, and the world that met him was broken. The sky above wasn't blue, or black, or even recognizable. It folded inward, fractal-like, with colors that defied the human spectrum, each hue whispering emotions he couldn't name. The ground beneath him throbbed faintly, not solid, not liquid, but something in between, like standing on the flesh of a dreaming god. Every breath he took was laced with scents that shouldn't exist. The sharp bite of ozone, the sweetness of burned sugar, and, somehow, the familiar musk of his childhood bedroom. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was a prison designed by creatures who had never known sleep, mercy, or the need for sanity. Somewhere nearby, a laugh echoed, his own laughter, but warped, like a recording reversed and slowed until it dragged across his ears like wet cloth. He turned, and the world turned with him, literally. The horizon rolled like a tide, gravity flipping sideways before correcting itself. Buildings rose from the earth like jagged obsidian thorns, flickering between form and formlessness, and through every surface shimmered faces, his mother, his war comrades, his dead lover, blinking in and out like corrupted memories. He was alone, or at least they wanted him to feel alone. Eli staggered to his knees, teeth clenched against the sensory assault. The Zha'til had mastered something far worse than torture. They had designed a neural prison, one that attacked not the body, but the mind itself. It was a living simulation that responded to emotion, warping itself like a mirror of madness. They called it the fracture. No human placed inside had lasted more than 72 hours before begging to die. Most dissolved into permanent vegetative states. Some just disappeared, their consciousness devoured by the simulation's shifting code. But as Eli knelt on the heaving dream flesh floor, sweat beading on his forehead, he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He smiled. It was small, cracked, full of grit and blood, but it was real. Because in the fractured echoes of his own thoughts, in the delayed tremors of his emotions bouncing back at him like sonar, he realized something the Zha'til hadn't accounted for. In order to contain him, they had connected him. His neural signature was now linked to their simulation core, deep enough to alter thought, deep enough to shape his prison around him. But that also meant he could read it, understand it, manipulate it. That was their mistake. They'd thought they were testing a fragile human mind, but what they'd really done was hand the galaxy's most dangerous strategist a direct interface into their empire's most secure infrastructure, and Commander Eli Voss had just begun to think. In the first 6 hours, Eli said nothing, not to the phantoms, not to himself. He sat still, cross-legged, in the center of that pulsating terrain while storms of static and memory raged overhead. The simulation adapted quickly, trying to find his breaking point. 1 minute it turned the landscape into a desolate battlefield, charred bodies crying out in familiar voices. The next, it became a childhood home filled with people he'd lost. The Zha'til didn't understand how memory worked for humans. They thought trauma was weakness, but Eli was forged in it. He'd buried more comrades than the Zha'til had, species catalogued. Pain didn't unravel him. It focused him. Every change in the environment was data. Every echo of thought, every digital heartbeat of the simulation was a clue. And Eli, the last graduate of Earth's defunct tactical cognition, Corp started mapping it with his mind. He wasn't just watching. He was feeling the lag between cause and effect. He breathed in, and the simulation adjusted its scent profile, just slightly slower than before. He exhaled, and the visual field distorted along a specific, because he screamed once, just once, not in pain but in test, and the sky cracked. Not metaphorically, literally. Lines of binary bled through the illusion. For 3 seconds, Eli saw the simulation's scaffolding, code flowing like veins, connections pulsing with alien intent. That was all he needed. 3 seconds. Enough. For a genius mind wired for pattern recognition to see a lattice, a structure, a flaw. That's when he made his first move. He blinked twice, syncing his internal pulse to the environment's rhythm, and imagined a red door. Not something from memory, something new, something the system couldn't categorize. And there it was, glitching into existence a few meters ahead, flickering like a skipped video frame. The system hesitated. It tried to correct it, but the door remained. That hesitation confirmed his suspicion. The prison didn't just read minds, it learned through them. And learning meant vulnerability. He walked through the door. On the other side, the simulation collapsed into raw wireframe. For a moment, white lines on a black void like the bones of a god's dream. Voices shrieked in Zha'tilian, digital panic echoing through the neural web, far away but closing in. Somewhere in the Empire, scientists were scrambling. Monitors were spiking. Protocols were failing. A human was not supposed to move freely, inside their sacred code. But Eli was no ordinary prisoner. He was probing the edges of their empire, from inside their minds, and he had just found the first crack. Across the stars, deep within the Zha'til high cognition nexus, a structure grown from living crystal and suspended in orbit around a dying white sun, alarms that had never before been triggered screamed into life. The overseers, ancient, beings of pure thought and neural latticework, clustered around the core simulation feed, their multifaceted eyes blinking in dissonant harmony. Commander Eli Voss was still breathing. Worse, he was interacting with the code space in ways their species hadn't considered possible. One overseer, designated Cathera 9, extended a tendril of thought into the fracture prison, attempting to excise the anomaly. But something unexpected pushed back. Not a firewall, not encryption. A mind, human, chaotic, beautiful in its unpredictability. The Zha'til had studied human biology. They had dissected brains. But they'd never faced what true human cognition was like when cornered. It wasn't logic. It was defiance set on fire. Inside the fracture, Eli felt the intrusion like a chill, across the back of his neck. A foreign presence trying to overwrite his thoughts like icy fingers searching his memories. But he was ready. He didn't fight it directly. Instead, he offered it something. A memory. A fabricated one. In it, he was a child again, lost in a field of red poppies on Mars Colony 7, singing a nonsense tune. The Zha'til probe latched onto the image, analyzing it for relevance, unaware it was being drawn deeper into a logic trap. The memory fractured and looped back, folding in on itself, becoming recursive, a feedback loop disguised as nostalgia. The Zha'til probe began to flicker. In their arrogance, the aliens had forgotten a simple truth. Humans lie. They adapt. They mislead. Their greatest strategies were born not from overwhelming power, but from deception and improvisation. And now Eli had introduced a virus, not in the traditional sense, but a psychological one. A set of paradoxical memories encoded in symbolic thought, designed to infect the pattern-seeking subroutines of the Zha'til neural framework. Where other species thought linearly, humans weaved spirals, myths, contradictions. The more the overseers tried to make sense of the anomaly, the deeper into the trap they went. Eli pressed forward. The wireframe void shifted around him, stuttering like a broken broadcast. The architecture was trying to reboot, but his mental imprint had already seeded itself into the decision-making algorithms. He no longer needed to guess where the weaknesses were. He could feel them now, like bruises beneath the skin of a giant. He reached out and pushed against one, a node pulsing with authority, a command channel buried in the simulation's neural fog. And suddenly, he wasn't alone. Dozens, hundreds of other prisoners flickered into view around him. Some sobbing, some screaming, some catatonic, all forgotten humans left to rot in Zha'til madness. Eli stared at them, grief punching him in the gut. But then he whispered, not in fear, but in purpose. Get up. We're taking this empire down from the inside. At first, nothing happened. The others stood or knelt or lay in various stages of neural collapse. Their eyes were wide, their minds frayed from months, maybe years, of psychological warfare. The fracture prison had broken them not with force but with loneliness, despair sculpted into digital architecture. But Eli didn't stop. He walked toward the nearest figure, a woman curled into herself, whispering something over and over like a broken mantra. "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real." Her skin flickered like poor holography, her neural signature failing to anchor fully to the simulation's current layer. He knelt beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder, not gentle but real, a tactile grounding point in a world that had none, and said, "I'm not part of the system. I'm human, like you." His voice had weight, not just emotionally, physically. The simulation shuddered slightly, and she looked at him, her eyes focused, just for a second, enough to break the loop. And in that moment, Eli saw the code ripple across her skin like ink in water. The prison was reacting, recalibrating. Somewhere deep in the system, a fail-safe triggered. Illusions began crawling back into place. Her dead husband appeared beside her, begging her to come home. But Eli grabbed her wrist and said the most human thing he could. "That's not him, and you know it. We don't have time to cry. We've got an empire to crash." That was when she screamed, not in fear, but in memory. It was like pulling a plug. Her form stabilized, her avatar hardened, and for the first time since she was taken, she stood. The simulation tried to overwrite her awakening, but Eli had already spread the corruption. His presence, the raw, unfiltered realness of his perception, was altering the prison's rules. And he realized he didn't need to hack every node manually. He just needed to wake people up one by one, because human minds weren't static. They were viral. Once they believed in something, really believed, it spread. He turned to the others. "You were captured, hurt, forgotten, but you're not gone. You're not alone. And I need you. I can't tear this place apart without you." His voice, carried in the simulation, not through sound, but through resonance. It struck chords buried deep in the minds of the other prisoners. A child blinked. An old soldier lifted his chin. One by one, faces turned. Focus returned. The simulation's world began to warp, the false sky fragmenting into glowing lines of alien thought structures as more minds began resisting passively, thinking critically, the very act the Zha'til had designed this system to suppress. Panic surged through the network. Somewhere far above, on the crystal fortress orbiting the dying star, the overseers watched hundreds of dead minds flare to life across the neural grid, glowing like wildfire across a dry forest. The prison was never built for this. It was meant to contain, not defend. And Eli Voss had just become something the Zha'til had no defense against. A belief. From the outer edges of the Zha'til empire, whispers began to spread. Not across mouths, but through data waves, subspace transmissions, and intercepted neural murmurs. It began as a glitch, a pulse in the simulation net. Then it grew, an echo bouncing off too many nodes replicated in places that should have been sterile. Entire sectors of the Empire's thoughtcast infrastructure began flagging anomalies. Overseers from 16 different thought clans convened in an emergency quorum, their translucent skulls pulsing in iridescent distress. The impossible was happening. A human mind, singular, statistically insignificant, was creating cognitive interference across the entire simulacra grid. They hadn't just underestimated humanity's resilience. They had misunderstood its infection potential. Eli Voss wasn't just resisting anymore. He was spreading. Within the fracture, Eli felt the simulation tighten like a noose. The environment warped in real time, desperate now, confused. Gravity fluctuated. The sky boiled into a storm of binary hail. Landscapes shattered, reformed, and exploded again. It wasn't elegant anymore. The simulation's psychological pressure systems were breaking under the strain of multiple awakened consciousnesses. Eli stood at the center, surrounded by over 70 former prisoners now lucid, many weeping, some screaming, but all thinking, all resisting. Each of them anchored the space more firmly in human logic, forcing the Zha'til to fight not just one mind but many. That was humanity's hidden strength. They didn't stand alone, not for long. The woman he'd awakened first, her name was Ava, a former military linguist, gripped his arm and said, "They're reacting. I feel them panicking. I can hear the system choking." Her voice was raw but filled with something dangerous. Hope. Eli nodded. "Good. Now let's break their damn windows." He turned to the group and raised his voice. "We don't need weapons. We are the weapons. Every thought you have, every contradiction, every random dream, every lie you've ever told, push it into the code. Think things that don't make sense. Flood the system. Confuse it. Make it human." What followed was chaos. Beautiful, electric chaos. One man laughed and imagined a waterfall made of clocks. Another conjured a memory of a wedding that never happened, yet felt as real as breath. Children sang songs with no melody. Veterans reimagined battles that twisted physics. Some started dreaming in layers, forcing the simulation to render infinite versions of their identities. The fracture prison, designed to isolate and oppress, was now filled with impossible ideas, paradoxes, art, emotion, all weaponized. The code buckled. Data pillars fell like dominoes. Entire subroutines short-circuited as they tried to categorize irrational emotional input. Eli walked forward through the madness, each step dragging him deeper into the heart of the system. And then, he saw it, a door, not one he imagined. Their door. A black, perfectly smooth obelisk set against nothingness. It pulsed with authority, with command-level access. Behind it, he knew, was the core. The link between the simulation and the wider Zha'til command network. If he could breach that, he wouldn't just crash the prison, he could reach the Empire. The black obelisk loomed before Eli like a monument to arrogance, humming with the quiet, lethal power of alien intellect. It wasn't guarded, because it didn't need to be. The Zha'til hadn't built it with the idea that anyone could reach. To them, this was a throne no prisoner would ever see, let alone touch. But now, dozens of lucid minds surrounded it, their collective thoughts pressing like static against the air. The simulation was crumbling. Eli could feel the pressure on the environment. Textures glitching, sound looping, distant screams of code trying to overwrite reality. The prison was a dying organism, and the door at its center was the only part still holding shape, still resisting him. He reached out. The moment his fingertips brushed the surface, it reacted, not with denial, but curiosity. The obelisk rippled with ancient Zha'til code, scanning him, processing neural data. Lines of thought architecture carved themselves into the air, glyphs spiraling through dimensional logic, testing his comprehension. But this was Eli Voss, graduate of Earth's final war colleges, fluent in 23 modes of alien cognition. He didn't fight the system's query. He embraced it, let it in. He projected memories, emotions, pieces of dreams, and buried within them a pattern, a key, a backdoor written in emotion, metaphor, and raw will. The obelisk hesitated, flickered, and then it opened. Inside, there was no corridor, no inner sanctum, just a white void filled with living threads of light. Command chains, interstellar data veins, the nervous system of the Zha'til Empire itself. They'd tied their prison directly into their greater infrastructure like a tumor wired into the brain. And now Eli was standing inside it. He felt it surge around him, an awareness ancient and immense trying to quantify his presence. Millions of alien minds connected to this lattice. And now, he was inside their thoughts. It was overwhelming. 1,000 voices screamed in foreign tongues. Visions of worlds he'd never seen poured into his skull. Logic spirals, genetic memories, whole civilizations worth of culture and power, flooding his senses. For a moment Eli staggered, bleeding from the nose, barely able to breathe. But then Ava's voice crackled through the simulation behind him. "You're not alone, Voss. Don't let them bury you. We're still with you." He smiled through the blood. Because in all the chaos he found something simple, something pure. A signal, weak, human, but still there, Earth's last distress call, buried in the simulation logs. The Zha'til had mocked it, archived it, forgotten it, but Eli grabbed it like a blade. He wrapped it in contradiction, in dreams, in raw, unresolved humanity, and launched it through the neural veins like a pulse bomb of emotion and irrationality. Not a virus, not a command, a story, and stories, Eli knew, were the one thing no empire, alien or otherwise, could ever truly control. Across the Zha'til dominion, spanning 9 spiral arms and over 100 conquered species, something began to unravel. Not violently, not all at once. It began as a feeling, a hesitation, a moment of doubt, like a note played out of tune, in a symphony of perfect obedience. Overseers in distant command stations paused mid-thought. Sentience matrices stuttered. Soldiers, bred for obedience and wired into the hive-mind, began to blink, slow, uncertain blinks, as a ripple of conflicting emotions moved through them. Confusion, curiosity, even fear. It wasn't a virus in the traditional sense. It was worse. It was belief, laced into metaphor and memory, threading itself into the very code of Zha'til infrastructure. A story, told from the heart of their most secure prison, now echoing across every thought stream in their empire. And it was human. Eli stood in the command void, his mind tethered to billions of alien synapses, his body trembling as the pressure of their collective awareness surged and twisted around him. He should have been erased. No Zha'til mind had ever tolerated contradiction for long. Its thought structure demanded order, hierarchy, precision. But now, within that ordered lattice, something irrational was blooming like a wildfire. Chaos wrapped in beauty. Emotions that didn't fit in any Zha'til definition. A father's grief, a soldier's last breath, a child's laughter in the middle of war. These were not just memories, they were weapons of disruption. Ava and the others held the collapsing simulation around him, pushing back against the environmental decay. Their minds burned with strain, but they kept feeding him moments. Real ones. A first kiss. A sunrise after a long night of death. A soldier choosing to disobey for something greater. The raw, jagged edges of human life, unedited and unresolved. These moments had no category in Zha'til code. They weren't logical. They weren't optimized. And because of that, they spread. The Empire's most brilliant AI began crashing not from attack, but from confusion. Whole sectors of thought space filled with recursive loops trying to decode why someone would forgive an enemy, or die for an idea. In the nexus orbiting the white sun, overseers screamed, not with mouths, but with neural dissonance. Their minds buckled as emotional paradoxes fed back through their circuits. One overseer tore itself apart, body unraveling into shards of psychic static. Another tried to sever from the grid, only to realize the infection was already embedded in its base. Architecture. The humans in the fracture, once discarded, once forgotten, had become a living virus of soul and sensation, and Eli Voss was the conductor of their orchestra. He turned toward the center of the command void, where a black sun pulsed. The Zha'til, prime directive. The thought kernel of the Empire. The root of obedience, conquest, certainty. It watched him, not as a being, but as a principle. A machine god of logic. Eli walked toward it and whispered something no alien had ever dared speak, aloud in its presence. "You lost the moment you tried to understand us." The black sun flared in protest. Reality within the command void bent inward, warping like a star collapsing into singularity. Eli felt his limbs stretch and contract in impossible rhythms, his thoughts bleeding out across dimensions. The Zha'til, prime directive, was retaliating, not with weapons but with definition. It was trying to reduce him, categorize him, strip him of ambiguity, and force him into a framework it could control. Human, mammal, species, aggressive, threat level, anomalous. Strategic profile, chaotic neutral, purpose, defiance. But every time it tried to label him, Eli responded with more. More contradiction, more unresolvable identity. He was a tactician, he was a child, he was vengeance, he was mercy, he was madness, he was hope. The prime directive screamed, not in sound but in logic, a desperate shriek of a mind built on certainty being force-fed meaninglessness. And yet, in that meaninglessness, it found something it had never encountered before. Freedom. That was humanity's secret. Not strength, not speed, not even intellect, but the ability to be unwritten, to shift in real time, to choose. Where the Zha'til saw contradiction as corruption, humans saw it as potential. A pulse erupted from Eli, carried by the consciousnesses of every awakened prisoner in the fracture. It slammed into the black sun like a tidal wave of unresolved dreams, memories, fears, loves never confessed, regrets that never faded. The raw emotional coding flooded into the directive's perfect lattice and broke it. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, and through those cracks poured possibility. Not commands, not data, but questions. Why conquer? What if peace? What if joy? The Zha'til's greatest strength had always been its unity, its seamless, purpose-bound society. But now minds across the empire began to fracture inward. Scientists paused, hands trembling, unsure why they wept. Soldiers laid down weapons, unable to justify killing an enemy they suddenly wanted to understand. Children born into indoctrination looked at the stars and wondered if there was more. All because a human, bleeding and half-broken, had turned a prison into a beacon. Eli staggered toward the directive as it flickered and trembled. "You built this empire on control," he said aloud, though his voice echoed through neural fields across light years. "But control isn't strength, it's fear wearing armor." The sun convulsed. Then, for the first time in its long existence, it dimmed, not extinguished, not destroyed, but changed, and Eli knew. The war was not over. But the empire was broken, not from force, not from fleet, but from a story told by survivors who refused to be forgotten. When Eli emerged from the command void, the fracture prison was no longer recognizable. The walls of pulsing flesh had dissolved into sky. The horizon stretched endlessly, blue and gold, filled with clouds shaped like memories. The others, Ava, the boy named Nico, the old Marine who only spoke in numbers, stood around him in stunned silence. The pressure was gone. The simulation wasn't attacking them anymore, it was listening. The prison, no longer under Zha'til control, had become something else entirely. A shared dream, unbound from purpose, a human reality layered onto alien code. The first hybrid consciousness in the known galaxy. Above them, the sky shimmered. Lines of Zha'til script drifted like pollen, command functions stripped of authority, now only symbols without force. Eli could still feel the remnants of the Empire's thought streams coursing through the neural lattice. They were scattered, frayed, uncertain. The prime directive had not been annihilated but infected, forever marked by a contradiction it couldn't purge, the idea that something could be true, even if it couldn't be understood. The simulation was still linked. To the wider grid, that was the real miracle. Eli had sent out the pulse through the Empire's deepest veins, and it had stuck. His story, their story, had nested itself into systems across thousands of worlds. Overseers trying to restore order were met with subroutines rephrased as poetry, with code that whispered lullabies instead of logic, with soldiers who dreamed at their posts and woke sobbing with no reason. The disruption was irreversible. The fracture was now a broadcast tower for sentient rebellion. Ava turned to him. "We're free. Really free. But what now?" Eli looked around at the people who had once been shadows. Their eyes were clear. They were still weak, still scarred, but alive. Reborn. Now, he said softly, with the exhaustion of someone who'd just cracked a god in half, now we go home or whatever's left of it. She shook her head. There might not be a home left. He nodded. Then we make one, not just for us. For every species they crushed, every mind they tried to cage. We know their systems now. We know how to talk to them in our language, through dream, through fear, through choice. In the distance, the simulation's edge blurred, forming a portal, a way out, rebuilt from the command lattice itself. But Eli paused. He looked once more at the fading shape of the black sun above them, still flickering in confusion, still trying to process a story it was never designed to hold. Let it keep trying, he whispered. Because even if the Zha'til reassembled their machines, rebuilt their code, even if they tried to start over, the infection would remain, buried in every circuit, every algorithm. Every child they trained would ask the wrong question, sing the wrong tune, dream the wrong dream. And in that dream, they'd hear a human voice. Would you like the final paragraph? Paragraph 10, the conclusion. Years passed. The Zha'til Empire, once a monolith of order stretching across stars, began to fracture. Not in war, but in thought. Planets stopped answering central directives. Entire sectors reinterpreted commands as riddles or art. One AI, overseer in the Zha'til quadrant, painted a mural across a moon instead of executing a rebellion. Another constructed a symphony from intercepted human dreams. Scholars of logic began to debate the impossible, emotion as power, choice as strength, chaos as potential. What had once been heresy became curiosity, and curiosity in time became hope. They called it the Voss paradox. No one knew where Eli Voss went after the prison collapsed. Some said he returned to Earth, lived in silence among ruins, watching humanity rise again from ash. Others claimed he fused with the code, becoming a ghost in the Zha'til network, a rogue signal appearing in dreams, rewriting simulations from within. On Resistance worlds, children were told stories of the man who hacked a god, who used nothing but thought and grief to topple giants. Among the Zha'til themselves, whispers persisted of the cognitive corruption, a myth of a being who could not be mapped, categorized, or killed. He became not just a man, he became a story. And the thing about stories, the thing the Zha'til never understood, is that you can burn books, silence voices, crush rebellions. But a story once believed, once felt, lives on in every mind it touches. Eli Voss became a contagion of belief. In every simulation, every prison, every cage the Empire ever built after, there was always the chance that someone inside might remember his name, might whisper it through the static, might start thinking, and that's how it ended. Not with fleets, not with fire, but with a single human thought, repeated across 1,000 broken chains. We are not numbers. We are not data. We are the impossible question. And in the silence that followed, even the stars paused to listen.